most disturbing true Alaskan horror stories. Story number 1, the Richardson Highway passenger. Marcus Thornwell had been driving freight through Alaska for 11 years, and the Richardson Highway between Fairbanks and Valdez was his regular route. On February 14, 2019, he started what should have been a routine overnight haul. His Kenworth loaded with construction equipment destined for a coastal development project. The temperature had dropped to -38 degrees, and his CB radio crackled with warnings about black ice near Paxson. Around 2:47 a.m., approximately 40 miles south of Delta Junction, Marcus noticed something unusual in his passenger side mirror. A figure stood on the shoulder, waving frantically in the beam of his trailer lights. Against his better judgment and the cardinal rule about picking up strangers in the Alaskan wilderness, something compelled him to slow down. The figure wore no coat, just a thin flannel shirt and jeans. Marcus pulled over, his air brakes hissing in the frozen silence. The man who climbed into his cab appeared to be in his mid-30s with dark hair and unremarkable features. He thanked Marcus profusely, explaining his car had broken down 5 miles back. His skin felt ice cold when they shook hands, but Marcus attributed this to the brutal temperature. They drove in comfortable silence for about 20 minutes, the passenger staring out at the dark tree line sliding past. Then the passenger spoke. "I appreciate this more than you know. I've been trying to get home since 1983. Marcus laughed nervously, assuming it was a joke. The passenger turned to face him, and Marcus noticed something deeply wrong with his eyes. They reflected the dashboard lights like an animal's, shining with an amber glow. "I died right here," the passenger continued, pointing to a stretch of highway ahead. "Rolled my truck in a storm. Took them 3 days to find my body." Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His GPS showed his speed dropping despite his foot steady on the accelerator. The temperature gauge inside the cab plummeted from 72 degrees to 48 in seconds. His breath became visible in the air. The passenger smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous for a human mouth. "Every few years, someone stops. Most don't make it to the next town. They get so scared they lose control." The highway ahead began to shimmer and distort, as if Marcus were viewing it through heated air despite the Arctic cold. Snow on the roadside started falling upward, defying gravity. The passenger's form flickered like a corrupted video file, sometimes solid, sometimes translucent. Marcus could see the seatbelt through the man's torso. "You seem different, though," the passenger said, calmer. "Maybe you'll be the one who makes it." Marcus forced himself to focus on the road, reciting his daughter's phone number in his mind, anything to maintain his grip on reality. The passenger reached toward the door handle, his fingers stretching impossibly long like taffy being pulled. "This is where I get off," he said. "Same place as always." Marcus glanced at his odometer. He'd somehow traveled 63 miles in what felt like 10 minutes. Impossible. The door opened before the passenger touched it. Wind that didn't exist outside howled through the cab. The passenger paused halfway out, turning back. "There are others like me on this highway, dozens of us, maybe hundreds. We're all trying to get somewhere we'll never reach." Then he stepped out onto the road at 70 miles per hour and simply dissipated like smoke in the wind. Marcus drove the remaining distance to Valdez without stopping, his heart hammering against his ribs. When he checked his dash camera footage later, the passenger seat remained empty throughout the entire journey. His CB radio had recorded only static during those 43 minutes. The timestamp showed he'd lost nearly an hour somewhere between Delta Junction and Paxson, time that simply didn't exist in his memory or his truck's computer logs. He reported the incident to his dispatcher, who pulled him from the Richardson Highway route permanently. Marcus discovered later that 17 truckers had reported similar encounters on that stretch of highway since 1985. 3 of them had driven off the road in panic, 2 fatally. He quit long-haul trucking entirely 6 months later. Now he drives local delivery routes in Anchorage, never traveling after dark, never alone. But sometimes in his rearview mirror during those brief winter afternoons, he sees a figure in flannel standing on distant shoulders, thumb extended, waiting for the next driver who'll make the fatal mistake of being kind. Story Number 2, The Nick Arm Broadcast. Jennifer Vasquez worked as a late-night DJ for KBRW, a small independent radio station serving the Matanuska-Susitna Valley. Her shift ran from midnight to 6 a.m., playing a mix of classic rock and taking call-in requests from insomniacs, truck drivers, and oil workers rotating off their shifts. On March 3, 2017, during a particularly quiet morning around 3:15 a.m., she received a call that still haunts her ability to work alone. The voice on the line was male, middle-aged, speaking with an odd, hollow quality as if calling from inside a metal container. "I need you to play Ain't No Sunshine by Bill Withers," he said, "for everyone listening out on the Kennick Arm. We don't get much music out here anymore." Jennifer cued the song, engaging in her usual friendly banter. "Calling from a boat?" she asked. "Fishing crew?" The voice paused for several seconds. "Something like that. We've been out here a long time. 53 days, actually." Something about the specificity made Jennifer uncomfortable. 53 days was an unusual detail. She played the song and moved on to other requests, but the caller phoned back at 3:47 a.m., then again at 4:12 a.m., each time requesting songs from the 1970s and 80s. Each time his voice sounded more distorted, more desperate. "Can you see the arm from your station?" he asked during the 4th call. "Can you see the lights?" Jennifer's station sat on a hill with a partial view of the Nick Arm's dark waters. She walked to the window and saw nothing unusual, just the typical scatter of distant lights from Palmer and Wasilla. "I don't see anything unusual," she told him. The caller made a sound that might have been laughter or sobbing. "Look for the Jenny Marie. We're the ones waving. We've been waving for so long." A cold sensation crept down Jennifer's spine. The Jenny Marie was a fishing vessel that had disappeared in Cook Inlet on January 9, 2017, exactly 53 days earlier. All 4 crew members were presumed dead after an extensive Coast Guard search. The story had dominated local news for weeks. "Who is this?" Jennifer demanded. "This isn't funny." The line went dead with a sharp crack that made her earpiece spark. Her station's phone system showed no record of the incoming calls. The number displayed as 0000000 in her log. Jennifer tried to continue her show, but at 4:51 a.m. her broadcast equipment began malfunctioning. Songs played backwards at random intervals. Static overwhelmed her microphone even when she wasn't speaking. Then, through the interference, she heard voices. Multiple voices, overlapping and desperate, all trying to communicate simultaneously. "Tell them where we are," one voice pleaded. "The cold stopped hurting after the 2nd day," said another. "My daughter's name is Rebecca. Tell her I'm sorry," a third voice whispered. Jennifer recognized one voice from his previous calls, the man who'd requested Bill Withers. "We're not gone," he said clearly through the static. "We're trapped between. The water took us but won't let us leave. Every night we try to reach someone. You're the first who's listened." Jennifer's computer monitor flickered and displayed a GPS coordinate. 61.1753 degree N, 149.900 a location in the middle of the Nick Arm. Her printer, which had been off, suddenly activated and produced a single sheet. On it was a photograph she'd never seen, printed from no source she could identify. It showed 4 men on a fishing boat deck smiling at the camera. She recognized the image from news coverage of the Jenny Marie's crew. The station's lights cut out completely. In the darkness, Jennifer heard water dripping despite being on the second floor of a sealed building. The temperature in her broadcast booth plummeted. Her breath fogged in the air. The voices from her speakers grew louder, more insistent, dozens of them now, maybe hundreds. All the lost souls of Cook Inlet and the Nick Arm, all trying to push through whatever barrier separated them from the living. At exactly 5 a.m., everything stopped. Lights returned, equipment normalized, and her show continued as if nothing had happened. Jennifer finished her shift in trembling silence. The photograph remained on her desk, impossible to explain. She reported the incident to station management and local authorities. The Coast Guard investigated the coordinates she'd received and found nothing but empty water and silt. Jennifer quit her position 2 weeks later and moved to Arizona. She hasn't worked in radio since. Can't even listen to it without experiencing panic attacks. The Jenny Marie's crew was never found, and their families still have no closure. But Jennifer knows something that keeps her awake most nights. The barrier between life and death grows thin over those dark waters, and the lost souls trapped there will keep reaching out, keep calling, keep trying to wave someone down, hoping desperately that someone, anyone, will finally help them come home. Story number 3. The Permafrost Door. Raymond Kelso specialized in foundation work for remote Alaskan construction projects, drilling into permafrost to set pylons for buildings and oil infrastructure. On August 19, 2016, his crew was working 37 miles northeast of Deadhorse, preparing ground for a pipeline monitoring station. Raymond had been operating excavation equipment in Alaska's North Slope for 19 years and thought he'd seen everything the frozen earth could reveal. Prehistoric bones, ancient ice formations, even a perfectly preserved mammoth tusk. On that particular afternoon, at a depth of 14 feet, Raymond's drill bit struck something that shouldn't exist in permafrost. Through his equipment's ground-penetrating radar, he detected a large rectangular structure, clearly artificial and impossibly old based on the ice strata surrounding it. After 2 hours of careful excavation with his crew of 4, they exposed what appeared to be a doorway made of dark metal, covered in symbols that resembled no language Raymond had ever encountered. The door measured approximately 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide, set into a frame that extended deeper into the frozen ground. Raymond's crew foreman, David Chen, ran a metallurgy test. The results made no sense. The material registered as an alloy containing elements that didn't occur naturally in combination, with traces of isotopes that suggested impossible age. The symbols carved into its surface seemed to shift when viewed peripherally, forming different patterns that hurt to look at directly. Against standard protocol, which dictated reporting and preserving any archaeological discoveries, Raymond made a decision he'd regret for the rest of his life. He decided to open it. The door had no visible handles or mechanisms, but when Raymond placed his hand on its surface, it swung inward silently, releasing a breath of air that smelled of copper and something organic, something rotten. Beyond the door was darkness so complete that their high-powered work lights couldn't penetrate it. It wasn't simply absence of light, it was darkness that seemed to actively consume illumination. Raymond's thermal camera showed nothing, as if the space beyond existed at absolute zero. David suggested calling their supervisor, but Raymond's curiosity overrode his caution. He tied a safety rope around his waist and stepped through the doorway, expecting to find a tunnel or chamber. Instead, he found himself standing in what appeared to be an enormous space, impossibly vast to exist underground. The ground beneath his feet felt solid but wrong, slightly elastic, organic. His flashlight beam died immediately, but he could sense movement in the darkness, vast, slow movements like something breathing in its sleep. Raymond tried to retreat and discovered the door had vanished behind him. Where it had been was only more darkness and that terrible sense of massive presence. Panic flooded his system. He pulled on the safety rope, but it went slack, severed by something he couldn't see. Then he heard voices, hundreds of them, speaking in languages he didn't recognize, some of them clearly inhuman, clicks and whistles and resonances that made his bones ache. The darkness pressed against him physically, examining him, tasting him. Time lost meaning. Raymond might have been in that place for minutes or hours. Something touched his face with appendages that felt like frozen metal and rotted meat simultaneously. His nose began bleeding spontaneously. When he tried to scream, the darkness rushed into his mouth, choking him with its thickness. Then abruptly he was lying on the permafrost surface, 20 feet from the excavation site. His crew was gone. The door was gone. The entire excavation had been filled in with ice that looked centuries old. Raymond's radio crackled with his foreman's voice. "Kelso, where the hell are you? We've been calling for 6 hours." But from Raymond's perspective, he'd been gone perhaps 30 minutes. His watch had stopped at the exact moment he'd entered the door. His body temperature registered 89 degrees despite the summer warmth. Most disturbing were his hands. The fingertips had turned completely black, not from frostbite, but from something else. Something that looked like they'd been dipped in the darkness itself. He was evacuated to Fairbanks Memorial Hospital, where doctors couldn't explain his condition. The blackness on his fingertips spread slightly over the next 3 days before stopping at his first knuckles. It never changed after that, permanent, dark as void, and cold to the touch. His crew reported that during those 6 missing hours they'd heard Raymond screaming from underground, but when they'd excavated the site, they'd found only ancient, undisturbed permafrost. No door, no structure, nothing. Raymond submitted his report knowing no one would believe it. The company classified the incident as equipment failure and possible methane hallucination. The site was permanently marked as unstable and never used for construction. Raymond continued working for 3 more months, but his blackened fingertips would sometimes twitch independently, moving in patterns that suggested they were spelling out words in those strange symbols he'd seen on the door. He finally quit after he woke one night to find himself digging in his backyard in Anchorage, trying to excavate something his conscious mind didn't remember losing. His wife left him 6 months later, unable to cope with his night terrors and the way he'd stand at windows in complete darkness, just staring out. His black fingertips pressed against the glass. Raymond knows he brought something back from that impossible space beyond the door. Something that lives in the darkness behind his eyes, waiting patiently for the chance to return to the frozen earth. To dig until it finds that door again and completes whatever transaction began the moment Raymond chose to open something that should have remained sealed forever. Story number 4, the Dalton Highway Loop. Curtis Webb had driven the Dalton Highway between Fairbanks and Deadhorse more than 200 times during his 7-year career hauling supplies to oil fields. The 414-mile stretch of mostly gravel road was notoriously dangerous. Avalanches, washouts, 100-mile gaps without services. But Curtis knew every curve, every turnout, every mile marker. On November 2, 2018, he began a northbound run that would fundamentally break his understanding of physical reality. He departed Fairbanks at 4:30 p.m. with a full load of drilling equipment, his route planned for a 16-hour journey with scheduled fuel stops at the Yukon River Camp in Coldfoot. The weather forecast predicted clear conditions, unusual for November but welcome. Curtis settled into the familiar rhythm of the highway. His GPS tracking his progress, his dash camera recording everything, his CB radio monitoring channel 19 for updates from other drivers. At approximately mile marker 115 just north of the Yukon River Bridge at 7:43 p.m., Curtis noticed something odd. He was passing the same distinctive rock formation for the 3rd time. a boulder shaped vaguely like a bear's head that sat 40 feet off the highway's east shoulder. This made no sense. He'd been driving continuously northward for 3 hours. His odometer confirmed he'd traveled 123 miles. His GPS showed his position correctly on the map, but that rock formation should have been 2 hours behind him. Curtis stopped at the Yukon River camp for fuel and checked his route logs. Everything appeared normal. He mentioned the rock formation to the attendant, who looked at him strangely and said, "Yeah, it's about 5 miles south of here. Has been for 50 years. Curtis continued north, now unsettled but attributing the confusion to fatigue. 15 minutes later, he passed the Bearhead Rock again, now on his left as it should be, heading north. He marked the time. 8:17 p.m. At 9:02 p.m., he saw it again, this time on his right as if he were traveling southbound, though his compass and GPS confirmed he was still heading north. His speedometer showed 55 miles per hour. His cruise control was engaged. The highway stretched straight and empty in both directions. Curtis grabbed his CB radio and called out to any drivers in range. A response crackled back immediately from a trucker named Sullivan. "I'm about 20 miles north of Coldfoot. Where are you?" Curtis checked his GPS. "I should be around mile marker 145 south of Coldfoot," Sullivan responded after a pause. "That's weird. I passed that point 40 minutes ago and didn't see any southbound traffic, but then again I've been driving this same stretch for what feels like 2 hours and haven't made any progress north." A third voice broke into the channel, female, frightened. "Is anyone else stuck? I've been trying to reach the Arctic Circle marker since 6 p.m. and I keep ending up back at the same turnout." Curtis's stomach turned to ice. The highway ahead began to shimmer in his headlights, not from heat or fuel spills, but from something else. As if reality itself were glitching, pixels of the physical world rearranging themselves. Mile markers started appearing in wrong sequences. 156, 142, 198, 131. His GPS showed his position jumping erratically along the highway's length, sometimes appearing to be in 2 places simultaneously. Other vehicles appeared suddenly on the road, headlights that shouldn't be there, traveling in physically impossible directions. Curtis saw a white pickup truck driving perpendicular to the highway, moving through the permafrost and tundra as if on an invisible road. A semi-truck ahead of him simply vanished between 1 second and the next, not turning off, not accelerating away, just ceasing to exist. The CB radio filled with overlapping voices, some speaking in English, others in languages Curtis didn't recognize, all describing the same phenomenon, being trapped in a loop, unable to progress either north or south. Curtis tried to maintain his sanity by following basic rules: keep driving, maintain speed, don't deviate from the road. But the Dalton Highway had become something else, a Mobius strip folding through impossible dimensions. He passed a rest area where he saw his own truck parked, himself sitting inside staring back at him with hollow, terrified eyes. The version of himself in the parked truck raised a hand in a gesture that might have been greeting or warning. At 11:38 p.m., according to his dash clock, Curtis spotted something that made him slam on his brakes. In the beam of his headlights, the highway ahead ended abruptly in a wall of absolute darkness. Not night sky, but absence, a vertical plane where reality simply stopped. Other vehicles sat abandoned before this barrier, some facing it, some turned sideways, all empty. Curtis engaged his reverse gear and tried to back away, but the wall of darkness rushed toward him at impossible speed. When it hit his windshield, Curtis experienced a sensation like being turned inside out. He saw the highway from every position simultaneously, a 4-dimensional view of the entire route from all times and angles at once. He saw other drivers trapped in the loop, some from years ago based on their vehicle models, all caught in the same repeating stretch of road. He understood in that moment of expanded perception that this section of highway had somehow become unstuck from normal space-time, creating a trap that occasionally snared travelers unfortunate enough to be present during whatever caused these breaks in reality. Then he was sitting at the Yukon River Camp fuel station, engine running, his truck still full of fuel. The attendant knocked on his window. "Hey buddy, you've been sitting here idling for 3 hours, you okay?" Curtis checked his dash clock. 7:43 p.m., the exact moment he'd first noticed the rock formation anomaly. His GPS showed he'd traveled 0 miles since leaving Fairbanks. His dash camera had recorded nothing but static for its entire memory capacity. Curtis completed his delivery run, taking 36 hours instead of the planned 16, driving at 20 miles per hour, stopping every half hour to confirm his progress was real. He reported the incident, but his company found no gaps in his GPS tracking log. To their systems, he'd driven normally. 17 other drivers have reported similar experiences on the Dalton Highway since 1992, always in November, always between mile markers 115 and 175. Curtis quit long-haul trucking and now works dispatch from an office in Fairbanks. He never drives the Dalton Highway anymore, can't even look at maps of it without experiencing vertigo, because he knows that somewhere in the quantum uncertainty of that remote stretch of road, versions of himself are still trapped in that loop, driving forever, passing that Bearhead rock formation for the 1,000,000,000th time, unable to escape a highway that has become its own dimension of repeated time and impossible geometry. Story from 5. The Homer Spit Figures. Catherine Riley worked as a wildlife biologist conducting winter bird surveys along the Homer Spit, the narrow, mile-long gravel bar extending into Kachemak Bay. On January 7, 2015, during a particularly brutal storm with winds gusting to 60 miles per hour, she was documenting eagle populations from her observation post near the end of the spit. The storm had driven most residents inland, leaving Catherine alone with her camera's thermal imaging equipment and spotting scope at 9:30 p.m. Through her thermal camera, which she used to locate roosting birds in the darkness, Catherine noticed 3 heat signatures standing on the beach approximately 200 yards from her position. The figures registered as humanoid, but strangely uniform in temperature. Exactly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit across their entire bodies, with no variation for clothing, wind exposure, or extremities. Normal humans showed thermal gradients, with faces and core warmer than exposed skin. These figures appeared as solid, even heat sources. Catherine adjusted her spotting scope, but the darkness and horizontal snow made visual identification impossible. The figures stood motionless despite the storm, arranged in a perfect equilateral triangle, each positioned exactly the same distance from the others. She watched them for 10 minutes. They didn't move, didn't huddle against the wind, displayed no behavior suggesting human discomfort in lethal weather conditions. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees with wind chill approaching -15. She decided to approach them, concerned they might be hypothermic tourists requiring assistance. As Catherine walked closer, her headlamp beam cutting through the storm, she noticed the sand around the figures. There were no footprints leading to their positions. They stood on pristine, snow-covered beach as if they'd materialized from nowhere. The wind should have erased tracks, but even the area directly around them showed no signs of disturbance, no depressions where feet met ground. At 50 yards, Catherine stopped. The figures were shaped like humans wearing dark clothing, but their proportions were subtly wrong. Too tall, perhaps 7 feet. Arms hanging slightly too long, heads tilted at identical angles. Through her thermal camera, she noticed something that made her blood ice over. The figures cast no heat signature on the ground. Normal humans radiated warmth downward, creating thermal halos on surfaces beneath them. These figures showed nothing, as if their heat existed in isolation from the physical world. Catherine called out, her voice stolen by the wind. The figures remained motionless. She took 3 steps closer, then stopped again. Her radio, which had been silent, suddenly erupted with voices, overlapping conversations in English and Russian, discussing fishing coordinates, weather conditions, and locations that didn't exist on any map Catherine knew. The conversations were archaic, using phrasing from decades past. One voice mentioned avoiding the shore figures near Bluff Point, the old name for the Homer Spit area. The leftmost figure turned its head toward her. The movement was mechanical, too smooth, rotating impossibly far until it faced completely backward. Catherine's headlamp illuminated where a face should be, but instead she saw a surface like black water, rippling and reflecting her light in ways that violated optics. The reflection showed not her current position, but her station 200 yards behind her, as if the figure's face was displaying her location from a different angle, a different time. All 3 figures began walking toward her simultaneously, moving in perfect synchronization, their steps matching exactly. Catherine ran. Her rational mind insisted there must be explanations. Hallucinations from hypothermia, optical illusions from the storm, equipment malfunction. But her primal instincts screamed danger. She reached her observation station and locked herself inside the small heated shelter, hands shaking as she grabbed her satellite phone to call the Homer harbor master. Through the station's window, she watched the 3 figures approach. They stopped exactly 20 feet from her shelter, reforming their perfect triangle with her station at the center. For the next 6 hours, until the storm cleared at 4:17 a.m., they remained motionless. Catherine's equipment malfunctioned continuously during this period. Cameras recorded only static. Her thermal imaging showed the figures' heat signatures pulsing in rhythmic patterns that matched no biological function, and her radio cycled through those archaic conversations on endless repeat. At dawn, the figures were gone. Catherine searched the area and found no trace of them, no footprints, no evidence of their presence. But in the exact center of where their triangle had been, she discovered a perfect circle of sand turned to glass, approximately 8 feet in diameter. The sand had been subjected to heat intense enough to create vitrification, yet nothing nearby showed burn marks or heat damage. The glass surface was smooth as polished mirror and reflected the sky with disturbing clarity. Catherine collected samples and reported the incident. Geological analysis confirmed the glass was created by temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit applied for a sustained period. No explanation exists for how such heat could be generated and controlled in a winter storm without destroying surrounding materials. The area around the glass circle showed no electromagnetic anomalies, radiation signatures, or chemical residues. Catherine continued her survey work for 2 more seasons, but never returned to the Homer Spit after dark. She researched historical records and discovered 17 similar incidents reported since 1912, all describing 3 figures standing in geometric patterns along the spit during winter storms. 4 witnesses who approached closer than Catherine did were found dead days later, their bodies showing no signs of trauma but completely dehydrated. Their tissues dried to leather despite being exposed to freezing precipitation. The glass circle remains on the Homer Spit, gradually being worn down by waves and weather. Locals avoid it, aware of stories passed down through generations of commercial fishermen. Catherine now works in wildlife management in Juneau, far from Kachemak Bay. She sleeps with lights on and checks her windows compulsively during storms, because she knows that whatever those figures are, they're still there, still standing in their perfect triangles, waiting in the darkness for the next person who gets close enough to see their impossible faces reflecting things that should not be reflected. waiting patiently to complete whatever incomprehensible purpose brings them to that narrow strip of land, extending into the black winter waters of the bay. Story number 6. The Buried Voice. Thomas McKinnon worked for Alaska Telecom installing fiber optic lines in remote communities. On September 23, 2014, his 3-person crew was trenching cable between Hughes and Alaskaghostencounter, 2 villages roughly 40 miles apart in the interior wilderness. Thomas operated the excavation equipment while his partners, Angela Reeves and James Hooper, managed cable spooling and connection boxes. At mile marker 7 of their route, Thomas's trenching machine struck something that shouldn't exist 15 feet below the surface. A voice. The audio came through his machine's ground sensors, which detected vibrations to avoid hitting buried utilities. The voice was male, speaking continuously in English, reciting numbers in sequences that followed no pattern Thomas recognized. The voice showed no signs of distress or emotion, simply reciting 37925184168397285. The numbers continued without pause, without breath breaks, mechanical in their precision. Thomas stopped digging and called his crew. Using handheld acoustic detectors, they triangulated the voice's source to a position approximately 14 feet underground in permafrost that showed no signs of previous excavation. The soil strata confirmed this area hadn't been disturbed in at least 200 years. Angela suggested underground water creating auditory illusions, but their equipment clearly picked up structured speech, not natural sound patterns. James advocated for calling their supervisor, but Thomas made the decision to excavate. They carefully dug a shaft, documenting everything for their required environmental impact reports. At 13 feet, Thomas's shovel struck metal, a cylindrical object about the size of a telephone pole made of a dull gray material that registered as unknown on their portable spectrometer. The voice emanated from this object, louder now, still reciting number sequences with that inhuman consistency. The cylinder's surface was covered in raised symbols that resembled early Cyrillic text mixed with mathematical notation. Angela photographed them for later analysis. The object appeared to be a sealed container with no visible seams or openings. As they cleared more soil, they discovered the cylinder extended both deeper and horizontally, suggesting a much larger buried structure. The voice continued relentlessly. 938614272498813. Thomas placed his hand on the cylinder's surface to assess its composition. The moment his skin made contact, the voice changed. It stopped reciting numbers and spoke his name. Thomas Alexander McKinnon, born March 17, 1981 in Anchorage, Alaska. Social Security number of 74836290. Mother's name Margaret, father's name Robert, deceased 2009. Thomas jerked his hand back, heart hammering. The object possessed information that should not be stored anywhere underground, that shouldn't exist in any physical form, buried for centuries. Angela and James heard it too, confirming Thomas wasn't hallucinating. The voice then spoke James's details with the same unnerving accuracy, followed by Angela's. It knew their addresses, their bank account numbers, their medical histories, intimate details of their lives it could not possibly possess. Then the voice began describing the future. Thomas McKinnon will receive diagnosis of pancreatic cancer on June 4, 2017. Angela Reeves will survive vehicle collision on December 22, 2015, sustaining left femur fracture. James Hooper will relocate to Seattle, Washington on August 9, 2016. The voice continued with increasingly specific predictions, creating a sense of predetermined fate that left all 3 crew members paralyzed with existential horror. James suggested they rebury the object immediately, forget they'd found it. But Angela, with scientific rigor overriding her fear, wanted documentation. She collected soil samples, took measurements, recorded the voice's output. Thomas just wanted to leave, overwhelmed by the implications of hearing his future death casually announced by something buried in frozen earth. As they debated their next action, the voice changed again. It stopped speaking English and shifted to a language none of them recognized. Harsh, clicking syllables that suggested no human vocal apparatus. The cylinder began to warm, its surface temperature rising from ambient cold to noticeably warm in seconds. The symbols on its surface started to glow with faint blue luminescence. Angela's radiation detector spiked briefly, then returned to normal. The warming continued. Thomas made the decision to evacuate and call authorities. As they climbed from the excavation, the voice resumed in English, but now it spoke in unison. Dozens of overlapping voices, all saying the same thing. Sequence incomplete, coverage insufficient, additional nodes required, deployment continuing. The cylinder's temperature reached over 100 degrees. The permafrost around it began melting, creating a pool of water that defied the surrounding frozen soil. They retreated to their work vehicle and drove 3 miles back toward Hughes before calling their company's emergency line. Thomas reported finding unknown buried infrastructure and requested guidance. His supervisor instructed them to mark the location and return to the village. Investigation teams would follow up. When Thomas, Angela, and James returned to the site 6 hours later with Alaska State Troopers and their company's safety coordinator, the excavation had refilled itself with frozen soil compacted as solid as the surrounding permafrost. No signs remained of their digging. The cylinder was gone. Ground-penetrating radar showed nothing unusual beneath the surface. Their photographic evidence had corrupted. Every image showed only white static. Audio recordings contained nothing but silence. Soil samples vanished from their storage containers, leaving only empty bags. The only proof of the incident existed in the 3 team members' identical testimonies and the persistent fact that every prediction the voice had made came true with disturbing accuracy. Thomas was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in June 2017. Angela broke her femur in a car accident that December. James moved to Seattle the following August. Thomas survived his cancer through aggressive treatment but quit telecommunications work entirely. He now operates a small boat charter service in Seward, avoiding interior Alaska. Angela transferred to fiber optic work in urban areas only. James left Alaska entirely and refuses to discuss what happened. The 3 of them haven't spoken since they submitted their final reports. Thomas knows the cylinder is still down there, still speaking in the darkness, still recording and predicting, part of some network of buried devices mapping human lives and futures for purposes beyond comprehension. Sometimes, late at night, Thomas swears he can still hear that voice in his mind, reciting numbers that might be coordinates, might be dates, might be countdown sequences to events he cannot prevent and will never understand until they arrive. With the precise timing, something buried in the frozen earth has already calculated and announced to the darkness. Story number 7. The Seward Highway Fog. Patricia Chen had been driving commercial courier routes in Alaska for 14 years, specializing in urgent medical supply transport between Anchorage and Seward. The Seward Highway's 127-mile route was scenic during daylight but treacherous at night, particularly the stretch between Turnagain Pass and Hope Junction, where the road carved through mountains with sheer drops to Turnagain Arm. On April 18, 2013, Patricia began what should have been a routine 3-hour run with emergency surgical supplies for Providence Seward Medical Center. She departed Anchorage at 11:47 p.m. under clear skies, her GPS showing estimated arrival at 2:53 a.m. Patricia had made this drive hundreds of times and knew every curve, every passing lane, every scenic pullout. Traffic was light, just occasional southbound vehicles and a few long-haul trucks heading toward the port. Around mile marker 43, approximately 20 miles south of Anchorage near McHugh Creek, Patricia drove into fog. This wasn't normal coastal fog. It appeared suddenly a wall of gray that her headlights couldn't penetrate beyond 20 feet. Patricia reduced speed to 35 miles per hour and activated her hazard lights. The fog had strange qualities. It swirled in geometric patterns, forming shapes that almost resembled structures, buildings, tunnels. Her radio filled with static that occasionally resolved into fragments of conversations in languages she didn't recognize. The GPS flickered, her position jumping erratically on the screen. After what felt like 30 minutes of cautious driving, Patricia checked her dashboard clock. 11:51 p.m. Only 4 minutes had passed since entering the fog. This made no sense. She'd traveled at least 8 miles based on her speedometer and odometer. Mile markers had become unreadable, obscured by the unnaturally dense fog. Patricia tried her cell phone to call dispatch. No signal. Her CB radio produced only that strange static and occasional voices speaking in toneless rhythm. The fog began to thin slightly, and Patricia saw other vehicles around her. Cars and trucks driving parallel to her, roughly keeping pace. Relief flooded through her briefly. She wasn't alone in this strange weather. Then she noticed the vehicles weren't on the road. They drove through the air beside the highway, traveling on invisible lanes that existed in the fog itself. Some vehicles were oriented correctly, others were sideways or inverted, their occupants clearly visible and seemingly unaware of their impossible positions. Patricia recognized one vehicle, a green Ford Explorer with a distinctive dent in its rear panel. She'd seen this vehicle in news coverage 3 years ago. It had gone off the road near Beluga Point, plunging into Turnagain Arm. The driver, a schoolteacher from Soldotna, had died. Patricia was looking at that vehicle now, watching it drive past her in the fog. Its dead driver visible at the wheel, eyes forward, hands at 10 and 2, following a route that existed in some layer of reality adjacent to the physical highway. More vehicles appeared, dozens of them, all maintaining their spectral lanes through the fog. Patricia saw cars from different eras, vehicles from the 1980s and 90s, some older, all driving in their own dimensions alongside the current road. Some of these vehicles had been in accidents Patricia remembered from news reports or first-hand witness. The fog wasn't just obscuring the road, it was revealing something else. All the past journeys, all the lost travelers, still driving their routes through time, trapped in endless repetition of their final trips. Patricia's own vehicle began to drift sideways. She gripped the wheel tighter, correcting course, but the sensation of solid road beneath her tires felt uncertain. The fog thickened again, and she found herself driving up an incline that shouldn't exist on this stretch of highway. Her GPS showed her position as stationary, though she was clearly moving. The incline steepened impossibly, until Patricia was essentially driving vertically, defying gravity. Other vehicles passed her at different angles, some upside down, one rotating slowly end over end while maintaining forward progress. She saw faces in the fog, people standing on the non-existent ground between the spectral traffic lanes. Some looked confused, others terrified. A few appeared peaceful. Patricia recognized several from missing person reports. One face belonged to Alexander Kuznetsov, a Russian immigrant who disappeared while driving to Seward in 2009. He stood in the fog watching the ghostly traffic pass, as if waiting for a bus that would never arrive. Patricia's vehicle completed the vertical climb and leveled out onto a road that looked exactly like the Seward Highway, but felt fundamentally wrong. The mountains were in incorrect positions. The water of Turnagain Arm appeared on her right when it should be on her left. Mile markers counted backward. descending from 94 to 93 to 92. She was driving north, but the road told her she was heading south. Her compass spun wildly, unable to establish any direction. At a marker reading 78, a number that didn't exist on the Seward Highway, Patricia saw an exit ramp leading to a rest area. Desperate for orientation, she took it. The rest area appeared normal at first. Parking spaces, restroom facilities, information boards. But the information boards showed maps of Alaska with coastlines in wrong locations. Cities that didn't exist. Roads connecting to destinations Patricia had never heard of despite living in Alaska her entire adult life. Other vehicles were parked in the rest area, engines running, headlights on, all empty. Patricia examined the closest one, a Toyota pickup with a 2011 registration. The driver's door hung open. On the seat was a driver's license belonging to Marcus Holloway, reported missing in February 2012 after heading to Seward. His wallet, phone, and keys remained in the vehicle. No signs of struggle or distress. He'd simply stepped out and vanished. Patricia returned to her van, terror overwhelming caution. She drove back to the highway entrance, determined to continue regardless of conditions. As she merged onto the road, the fog began to dissipate with unnatural speed, pulling back like a curtain being drawn. Within seconds, she was driving under clear skies on the normal Seward Highway. Her GPS reestablished position. Mile marker 43 McHugh Creek area. Her clock read 11:49 p.m., 2 minutes after entering the fog. 2 minutes that had contained at least an hour of impossible experiences. Patricia continued to Seward and delivered her supplies at 2:47 a.m., only 6 minutes earlier than her original estimated arrival despite the fog encounter. Her dash camera had recorded nothing unusual, just normal highway driving through light fog lasting approximately 90 seconds. But Patricia's memory was crystal clear, and her vehicle's maintenance computer showed anomalies. Temperature fluctuations from normal to extreme cold to impossible heat. Altitude readings showing climbs to elevations far exceeding the highway's actual maximum. And GPS logs revealing her vehicle had occupied positions simultaneously across 40 different miles of highway. She reported the incident to Alaska State troopers who took her statement but offered no explanation. Patricia discovered that 11 other drivers had reported similar experiences on the Seward Highway since 1996, all involving fog that revealed overlapping layers of time and space. All reporting sightings of missing persons and vehicles. None of the reports had led to any investigations or explanations. The phenomenon was simply noted and filed, unexplainable and terrifying. Patricia completed 2 more courier runs on the Seward Highway before requesting permanent reassignment to Anchorage-only routes. She refuses to drive that section of road anymore, especially at night. Because she understands now that the Seward Highway doesn't just follow the coast between Anchorage and Seward, it travels through layers of reality where past and present overlap, where the boundary between the living world and something else grows thin, where fog doesn't just obscure vision but reveals the countless journeys trapped in eternal repetition, and where one wrong turn might lead a driver into a dimension where they'll join the spectral traffic. Driving forever through impossible angles and non-existent roads, visible only to the next unfortunate traveler who enters the fog and realizes too late that some highways don't just connect cities, they connect moments in time that should remain separate, and once you've driven between them, you can never be certain you've truly returned to the correct version of reality. Story number 8. The Denali Descent. Michael Torres worked as a mountaineering guide on Denali, leading commercial expeditions up North America's highest peak. Over 12 years, he'd summited 27 times and prided himself on meticulous safety protocols and deep respect for the mountain's lethal conditions. On June 11, 2012, Michael was descending from Camp 4 at 14,000 feet with a group of 6 clients after a successful summit push. Weather was excellent. Clear skies, minimal wind, visibility extending for miles. What happened next would end his guiding career and leave him with questions that haunt his every waking moment. At approximately 3:20 p.m., while navigating the fixed ropes between Camps 4 and TRUE, Michael noticed something wrong with the terrain. He'd descended this exact route dozens of times and knew every crevasse, every ice feature, every rock outcropping. The landscape ahead didn't match his memory or his topographic map. The angle of descent seemed too steep. The glacier's surface showed crevasse patterns in configurations that shouldn't exist. He stopped the team and consulted his GPS, which confirmed their position but showed terrain features that contradicted what his eyes perceived. Michael's second guide, Robert Yu, confirmed the discrepancy. The mountain had changed. Subtle alterations, nothing dramatic but enough to be unquestionably wrong. A serac that should have been 200 yards to their left appeared to be directly in their path. The descent angle felt steeper despite the GPS showing correct coordinates. Distance markers on the fixed ropes were spaced incorrectly, compressed closer together as if space itself had contracted. The team continued carefully, all 8 members roped together following the fixed line. After 40 minutes of descent, they should have reached Camp 3. Instead, they found themselves at Camp 4, the same point they'd departed from. Michael checked the time, 4:02 p.m. They'd been descending for 42 minutes, covering approximately 1,000 vertical feet based on their effort and the terrain they'd crossed. But they were back where they'd started. The camp's distinctive features were unmistakable. The same equipment caches, the same tent platforms, even the same crampon marks in the snow they'd made that morning. Robert suggested they'd somehow reversed direction without realizing it, though both guides knew this was virtually impossible on fixed ropes. Michael chose a different descent route, one that angled more westerly. The team descended for another hour. At 5:14 p.m., they arrived at Camp 4 again. Same location, same camp, impossible. Their GPS showed they'd descended properly. The coordinates indicated they should be at Camp 3's location. But visually, physically, they were at 14,000 feet, exactly where they'd been 3 hours earlier. Michael's clients were becoming frightened, their oxygen-deprived minds struggling to process the impossibility. One woman, Linda Patterson, started crying. Michael maintained calm, suggesting they rest, rehydrate, and recheck their equipment. Perhaps there was a GPS malfunction. Perhaps they were experiencing altitude-induced confusion. But Michael knew better. The mountain wasn't letting them descend. They tried a third route, this time following the west buttress directly. Michael led the team down through increasingly difficult terrain, moving deliberately away from the fixed ropes, making absolutely certain of their direction by compass, GPS, and visual landmarks. They descended for 90 minutes, covering what should have been 1,500 vertical feet. When they stopped to rest, they were at Camp 4. Again. The same camp, now with their previous tracks visible in the snow. 3 sets of trails leading away from camp in different directions, all somehow returning to the same point. The sun began setting, and Michael made the decision to camp for the night. Perhaps whatever phenomenon was affecting their navigation would clear by morning. As the team pitched tents and melted snow for water, Michael noticed something that made his survival instincts scream alarm. In the snow around camp were dozens of other tracks, many of them old, frozen into ice. The tracks formed patterns, multiple trails spiraling outward from camp in different directions, all returning. Someone else, perhaps, many others, had experienced this same impossible loop. That night, at approximately 11:30 p.m. during Alaska's endless summer twilight, Michael heard voices outside the tents, calling for help. speaking in English with accents he couldn't place. He emerged to investigate and saw figures moving in the distance, perhaps 300 yards away, a roped team of climbers descending toward camp. Michael used his radio to hail them. No response. The figures continued their approach, but their movements were wrong. Too smooth, too synchronized, as if they were recordings played on loop rather than actual humans navigating difficult terrain. As the figures drew closer, Michael realized they were descending the exact route his team had taken earlier that day, retracing their path with perfect precision. The figures wore climbing gear from an older era, equipment styles from the 1990s or early 2000s. Michael watched them approach Camp 4, pass directly through where his tents were pitched without acknowledging their presence, and continue downward. He followed them with his eyes. They descended 200 yards, then simply faded from view, not disappearing behind terrain but gradually becoming translucent and vanishing. Robert had witnessed it too. They woke the clients and explained they were experiencing severe unexplained phenomena and needed to attempt an emergency descent at first light regardless of normal safety protocols. At 4:15 a.m., the team began descending again, this time moving as rapidly as possible while maintaining safety margins. Michael chose a completely different route, one that traversed eastward before descending, deliberately avoiding any path they'd previously taken. They descended for 3 hours, making excellent progress, covering terrain that felt correct and matched their maps. At 7:23 a.m., they arrived at Camp 4, the same camp, now with 4 sets of previous tracks visible. Michael's hands were shaking as he checked his GPS. It showed them at 9,800 feet, the elevation of Camp 3. But they were clearly at 14,000 feet, surrounded by the familiar landmarks of Camp 4's location. Linda Patterson suffered a panic attack. Another client, James Morales, suggested they were dead, that they'd fallen somewhere during the descent and were experiencing some form of afterlife loop. Michael forced himself to think rationally. He used his satellite phone to call base camp, explaining their situation. The base manager confirmed their GPS coordinates showed them at Camp the 3rd. He had visual confirmation of a team at that elevation in camp, but Michael was looking at Camp 4's distinctive features: the crevasse field to the north, the angle of the summit ridge, landmarks that couldn't be mistaken. Michael made a decision that violated every safety protocol. They would descend continuously without stopping, roped together, moving as fast as terrain allowed. If they were trapped in some form of spatial anomaly, perhaps rapid movement through it would break the loop. For 6 hours, the team descended relentlessly. They covered terrain, they expended enormous physical effort. They descended thousands of vertical feet according to every instrument and sense they possessed. At 1:47 p.m., they walked into Camp 3rd, the real Camp 3rd, with other climbing teams present who confirmed they'd just watched Michael's group descend normally over the past hour. The GPS coordinates matched. The terrain matched. They'd escaped. Michael checked his satellite phone's GPS log. According to the data, they'd descended normally from Camp 4 to Camp 3 between 4:15 a.m. and 1:47 p.m., a longer time than normal but not impossible. There was no record of the previous attempts, no indication of the loops. Only Michael's team's memories and the photographs they'd taken, which showed timestamps revealing they'd photographed Camp 4 from 4 different arrival times across 10 hours. Michael reported the incident extensively, triggering an investigation by the National Park Service. Rangers found the spiral patterns of old tracks around Camp 4, some dating back years based on their preservation in permanent snow. 11 previous climbing parties had reported similar experiences since 1987, all describing descents that returned them repeatedly to starting points, all eventually escaping but unable to explain what had happened. 2 climbing parties had never escaped. Their last known positions were at 14,000 feet, and despite extensive searches, they were never located. Michael never guided on Denali again. He works now in outdoor education at sea level in Washington State, teaching climbing skills on small rock faces where the worst that can happen is a short fall onto safe belay. He dreams regularly of descending endless fixed ropes that lead nowhere, of arriving repeatedly at camps he's desperate to leave, of mountains that refuse to release their grip on those who dare to challenge their heights. Because Michael knows that Denali isn't just a mountain, it's something else, a place where physical laws occasionally bend, where space folds back on itself, where climbers can become trapped in loops of their own descent, and where the mountain itself decides who will leave and who will remain, circling forever through impossible geometries of ice and stone, descending eternally but never reaching the safety of lower ground. Story number 9. The Talkeetna Tower. Rebecca Nolan worked as an air traffic controller at Talkeetna Airport, the primary hub for mountaineering flights to Denali. Her position in the control tower provided expansive views of the Alaska Range, and over 8 years she'd guided thousands of small aircraft safely through challenging mountain weather. On July 27, 2011, during a routine evening shift, Rebecca tracked an aircraft that would fundamentally alter her understanding of what was possible in the skies she monitored. At 8:34 p.m., a Cessna 185 registered as November 7-3. Tango Mike contacted her tower requesting clearance for approach. The pilot identified himself as Gregory Sanderson, returning from a glacier landing on Denali with 4 climbing clients. Rebecca confirmed his position via radar, cleared him for runway 21 approach, and provided weather conditions. The communication was routine, professional, completely normal. Gregory acknowledged and began his approach pattern. Rebecca visually acquired the Cessna at approximately 6 miles out, descending through scattered clouds at 4,500 feet. The aircraft appeared normal. Landing lights activated, proper approach speed, correct altitude. She continued tracking via radar while maintaining visual confirmation. At 3 miles, Gregory reported his position and confirmed runway in sight. Rebecca cleared him to land. The aircraft continued its approach, passing through 2 miles, then 1 mile, fully visible in the late evening light. At half-mile final, the Cessna vanished. Not behind clouds, not below the tree line. It simply ceased to exist between one moment and the next. Rebecca's eyes were locked on the aircraft when it disappeared. Simultaneously, her radar contact stopped displaying. No transponder signal, no primary return, nothing. The radio went silent mid-transmission. Gregory had been saying 3 Tango Mike on short final, when his voice cut out with a sharp electronic pop. Rebecca immediately declared an emergency, initiating search and rescue protocols. She contacted other aircraft in the pattern, asking if they had visual on November 7-3 Tango Mike. Negative. She checked all her equipment, radar, radio, backup systems. Everything functioned normally. She contacted Anchorage Center to check if they'd picked up the aircraft on their radar scopes. Negative. The Cessna had simply stopped existing in controlled airspace. Alaska State Troopers and Civil Air Patrol launched search operations within minutes. They focused on the approach corridor between the aircraft's last known position and the runway, expecting to find wreckage. Rebecca provided exact coordinates and altitude from her last radar return. Search aircraft found nothing. No debris, no crash site, no sign of impact. The terrain below the approach path showed no disturbance. It was as if the Cessna had evaporated mid-flight. Rebecca remained at her station, replaying the event in her mind, when at 9:47 p.m., 73 minutes after the disappearance, her radio crackled with a familiar voice. Talkeetna Tower, November 7-3 Tango Mike on 5-mile final for runway 21, requesting clearance to land. It was Gregory Sanderson. His voice sounded identical to his earlier transmission. Rebecca's hands shook as she keyed her microphone and asked him to confirm his position. Gregory responded with coordinates that placed him exactly where he'd been at 8:34 p.m. when he'd first called for approach. Rebecca's radar showed the Cessna, exactly where Gregory reported, beginning the same approach pattern. She watched the aircraft descend, her heart pounding. This made no sense. She contacted the search aircraft and reported the development. They confirmed visual on the Cessna and fell into formation to escort it in, concerned about possible pilot disorientation. Rebecca cleared Gregory to land, and this time the aircraft completed its approach without incident, touching down at 9:53 p.m. Gregory taxied to parking, and Rebecca watched ground personnel approach the aircraft. Through binoculars, she observed Gregory and his 4 passengers deplaning. They appeared confused but physically unharmed. Rebecca's supervisor took over tower duties while she went down to interview Gregory directly. When she reached the parking area, Gregory was arguing with Alaska State troopers, insisting he'd done nothing wrong, that his flight had been routine and uneventful. Rebecca asked Gregory what time his watch showed. He checked, 8:55 p.m. Rebecca showed him her phone. 9:58 p.m. Gregory's watch was over an hour behind. His passengers confirmed their watches showed the same time, synchronized with Gregory's. The aircraft's clock showed 8:55, but more than an hour of actual time had elapsed. Rebecca explained that his aircraft had vanished from radar and visual observation, that search and rescue had been launched, that he'd essentially disappeared for 73 minutes. Gregory had no memory of any discontinuity. From his perspective, he'd made one continuous approach, calling in at 5 miles and landing normally. He had no explanation for the time discrepancy or the initial disappearance. His passengers confirmed his account. They'd experienced one normal approach and landing with no gap, no missing time, nothing unusual. The aircraft's engine log showed flight time matching their perception, not actual elapsed time. Federal Aviation Administration investigators examined the aircraft exhaustively. They found no mechanical issues, no explanation for the radar disappearance, no reason the aircraft would vanish mid-approach. The event was classified as unexplained and filed in a growing database of similar incidents. Rebecca researched that database and discovered 19 previous cases of aircraft disappearing temporarily from radar in Alaska's skies since 1973. All reappearing minutes to hours later with pilots unaware of any discontinuity. 3 weeks after the incident, on August 16th, Rebecca was working another evening shift when she received a call on the emergency frequency. The voice was male, panicked, unfamiliar. "Talkeetna Tower, I need immediate assistance. My aircraft is stuck. I've been trying to land for hours, but I keep restarting the approach. The runway disappears every time I get close." Rebecca felt ice flood her veins. She asked the caller to identify his aircraft. "November 7-3 Tango Mike." U.S.A. responded. Rebecca checked her radar. No contact. She visually scanned the approach corridor. No aircraft visible, but the voice continued on the radio, increasingly desperate. "I can see the airport, I can see the runway, but every time I try to land, everything resets and I'm back at 5 miles. My fuel gauge doesn't make sense. It shows full, but I've been flying for hours. My passengers are terrified. Please help me land." Rebecca asked the pilot his name. "Gregory Sanderson," he replied. Rebecca had Gregory Sanderson's phone number from the previous incident. She called it immediately from her cell phone. Gregory answered, confused about why the tower was calling. He was at home in Anchorage, nowhere near Talkeetna. Rebecca asked if he was scheduled to fly. No. His aircraft was in maintenance at Merrill Field. Rebecca felt reality fragmenting around her. She was speaking to Gregory on her phone while simultaneously hearing someone claiming to be Gregory on her emergency frequency. The voice on the radio continued transmitting for 17 minutes, describing repeated attempts to land that kept resetting him to 5 miles out, trapped in a loop of approaching but never arriving. Other controllers in the tower heard the transmissions. They recorded them, confirmed they were real radio traffic. Then, at 10:08 p.m., the voice transmitted one final message. "I see other aircraft in the pattern with me now. Dozens of them. They're all trying to land too. We're all stuck here. How long have we been—" The transmission cut off and never resumed. Rebecca requested FAA investigation of the transmissions. Analysis confirmed they were genuine radio traffic on emergency frequency from an aircraft claiming to be November 73 Tango Mike. But that aircraft was documented to be in a maintenance hangar in Anchorage during the time of the transmissions, confirmed by multiple witnesses. The voice analysis matched Gregory Sanderson's speech patterns, but Gregory had an airtight alibi. He'd been in a restaurant with friends at the exact time, with credit card receipts and witnesses confirming his location. Rebecca requested transfer to a different facility. She couldn't continue working in a tower where aircraft vanished and returned, where voices from planes that shouldn't exist called for help she couldn't provide. She now works air traffic control at Fairbanks International, monitoring commercial jet traffic at high altitudes. But she still hears that voice sometimes in her dreams, trapped in endless approach. Seeing dozens of other aircraft all circling, all trying to land, all caught in loops between moments of time where they vanished from one reality but never fully arrived in another. Rebecca knows that somewhere in the skies above Talkeetna, aircraft are still flying approach patterns that never end, their pilots unaware they've become trapped in temporal loops, continuing to call towers that can't always hear them trying, desperately to land at airports that exist just slightly out of phase with the reality they once left and can never quite return to.